Thank you, everyone. I'm not sure how many people here have been to other DevOps days, but each one is unique in terms of the logo that they prepare. I would put this in the S tier category of logos we get for DevOps days. The only thing possible you could improve upon it is if you had a pile of beef brisket underneath it, just to really emphasize the best part of Kansas City. So this is the automation Firehose, be strategic and tactical. My name is Thomas Haver. So on today's journey, I'm gonna level set with you about shared understanding regarding some of the quality practices specifically related to test automation that we should engage in. To go through that, I'm gonna provide you a little bit of an origin story related to some of the common challenges that we've faced over the last 20 years in this space, as well as some common framework and tools you could adopt, the challenges that you are expected to encounter today or in the future as you grow, as well as how you can actually schedule in those changes, have some actual action items associated with it that you can take back and improve at your company. So as was mentioned, I'm a master software engineer. That's a very arrogant title. That's only given out to specific people at my company, M&T Bank, and it's given out to those individuals who can't say no to problems. When they're given the absolute worst and most challenging problems, they put these people on. So it's not really that they're smart, it's more that they're dumb and persistent until the problem is solved. Before I was in IT, I worked as a scientist for around 10 years in molecular fluorescence spectroscopy and microscopy. I know we've got another physics nerd out there as a speaker. I'm also an avid board gamer. I own more than 4,000 games. Thank you much. Oh, we got some, of course, talk to an IT crowd, you mentioned gaming, you're absolutely gonna have some common friends in there. My favorite game is Diplomacy. Old game, it's known as the destroyer of friendships. Probably has something to do with the reason why I have to travel around the country and the world to actually play this game. I'm also an evangelist for Ruby Cucumber. It sort of has a soft spot in my heart because it's the tool of choice I like to use to help teams adopt behavior-driven development. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't give thanks to my cartoon family at home. So thank you very much for taking care of the kids while I get a chance to go around and enjoy some fabulous barbecue and talk tech in Kansas City. So let's start with an origin story, provide some good background. And one of the ways in which to do it is to try to establish a shared understanding. So when I talk about strategy, what I mean is a plan, an action, or policy designed to achieve an overall goal. Whereas tactics is the art or skill of employing your available means to achieve your end. So if you've noticed, the presentation here is thematic, so we'll go back into Infinity War. So Star-Lord had a fantastic strategy for defeating Thanos, but it was his own emotional tactics that ended up costing his team, and Thanos was able to snap half the universe. So even though you may have a great strategy, if you have poor tactics, you're not gonna succeed. Vice versa is true as well. So you need to have both. So keep that frame of reference in mind when we talk about those challenges. And let's go into the Wayback Machine. For some of you who are gray hair or no hair like myself, one of the common challenges that we faced is in working on Internet Explorer, everyone's favorite web browser, specifically Internet Explorer 6. Years ago, Microsoft had a blog that they had posts from various high-level employees to talk about some of the challenges they encountered, some of the cool stuff that's coming up. And one of those, many years ago, was about the challenges of working on Internet Explorer. So every time that they needed to go through a release with IE, they needed to consider these different testing variables whenever they wanted to push out any sort of change. So you can imagine the different OS versions that it has to go across, the different servers, and 36 different language binaries meant that you had a massive amount of combinations that you had to go through and validate. So even if you had test automation in place, it was still going to be very challenging to get all the combinations and the coverage that you needed. What they decided to do at the time to best address this problem is something that we more refer to as persona testing today, is they tried to bucket together common contexts or setups for their end users or their clients to focus testing in those areas. So that way, they could get the most common combinations and have a good deal of test coverage. Now, fortunately, we only have the remnants of IE buried within Edge today, because now it's built on Chromium. But you see, even with a company that has the resources that Microsoft did, you still end up encountering those same sort of challenges. There's never enough time, to quote Jean-Claude Van Damme from Time Cop. Right? I've worked with a lot of different organizations and now hundreds of teams. And whenever I go into a new space, often the leadership, whether it's business or technology leading it, often expects the same thing. I want your test automation to save time and lower costs while raising quality. And by the way, you can't affect our project delivery timelines, and you can't steal our high-value SMEs. It has to be done magically. But there's no magic fairy dust that you can sprinkle on an application to get them to deliver better. It does take effort, and it takes effort that's going to take the capacity away from existing team members to be successful. So if you don't have the magic fairy dust, what do you do to level set and move forward? Well, you work from an empirical basis, using evidence, return on investment, to absolutely advocate for your position. So also going in the Wayback Machine. I'm showing like a sort of a history of tech. This is from Elfriede Dustin, now more than 20 years old, from her book about implementing automated software testing, that over the course of time, as an application grows old, it becomes more difficult to test, sort of like a no-duh for us. The test coverage and quality drops while the cost and time to deliver increases. Well, for a period of time, the belief was, all right, we're going to introduce automation, and it's going to solve a lot of problems. That's why it's sort of like a discrete line in here. You've introduced automation, great, and magically, the time and cost to deliver drops, your test coverage goes up. But we know that's not the case. Because if you introduce a tool, but you don't have bounds around it, around best practices to use, training the people, and the support behind that tool, you've just introduced another application that you have to manage, like the application under test, and you're going to end up increasing the time to actually deliver for that. And also, when it does fail, and it has failed a lot for the teams that I've worked with, you're going to remove sort of the confidence that people have in test automation. This doesn't work, we should skip it, especially when you go through competing interests of we need to deliver. Why don't we just cut out on that unit test coverage? Yeah, sure thing. We'll get back to it next iteration, you say, lying to yourself. Similar to the way I lie to myself saying, I'm going to go to the gym next week. No. So when I work with teams, I want to talk about the realistic way that they can improve their automation. And I traditionally break up the strategy into these sections. Like, what is the scope that we're looking for here? Single application, end-to-end across multiples. What are the objectives that you want to achieve as a team? What's the approach we can use over that time to get there? What are some of the best framework and tools we can use for your team? What's the environment that we're working in? How can we actually schedule it in place? And the most important part is actually the people component. Who do you have in place today? Do they have the technical skill set to deliver? Do they have the aptitude to actually deliver it? Or do we need to bring in individuals externally to help support this initiative? So from the approach perspective, I try to help out people identify ways in which they can make things consistent within a team and across teams, especially if you have to go through system integration testing, end-to-end testing, add these things into standard pipelines that are expected for your organization. And one of those is very simple, is what should we actually automate? You want to have a consistent response regardless of what feature is flowing into your team, regardless of whether you're going through a platform decommission or you're going through a merger with another company. You want to take a consideration of, is this something that's highly repeatable? Do we have control over the data or not? Is this something that's high value for us, as in on a critical path? You want to use these questions as sort of a standard, as a checklist, that then get burned into the brains of the people doing this work so they can understand where we should actually devote our time. As in, we could try to automate everything. And if you put your mind to it, you probably can. But should we actually automate this? And additionally, when I go and work with teams, I like to consider the actual cost of automation. We know it's not magical that you introduce a tool and you're going to be successful. There's a lot of costs involved whenever you need to actually develop automation. So one of those is you change your mindset. Any sort of scripts that you put in, whether it's baked in with your code base or something separate, should be treated the same as development code. That is to say, you are working with the mindset that every single new test script factors in the maintenance costs. It's not pure value add. And you need to level set that at the beginning because you're not going to meet expectations. But every time we devote our effort to these new automation scripts, it's going to cost us. Some costs are in the tool itself, going through OS upgrades, language upgrades, training people, onboarding them for that, maintaining that documentation. These are costs that are not often factored in when people say, here's an ROI for test automation. Factor it in from the beginning, so that way you have a good level set on what you need to achieve. Additionally, we don't work in ideal circumstances. I've never worked with a single team that is like the most agile team in the world. They can absolutely do everything according to what they want to do. There's all these organizational constraints. My current company is a bank, and if you've ever worked for, say, a utility, government entity, financial institution, you know that we end up being a bit of a technology museum. As in, we have things that are decades old sitting alongside the new stuff, and they all have to work together in the same system. You know, I work and support an online banking platform that was put in place before I finished high school. I support Big Iron that was put in place before I was born. And then I got that alongside people, you know, working with Docker and Ansible and deploying on a daily basis. So what are some organizational constraints? Well, we're always going to be limited by that delivery schedule, the project budget, and the technical skill set. You know, so we can't automate everything. So we need to take that risk-based approach. And that is, we need to automate based upon legal requirements, criticality of the flow, frequency. We need to make sure that we can look for those complex scenarios that are very frustrating for people, especially with a lot of data setup involved. And those are the things that we should automate. And we move from using a checklist to something akin to a scorecard. So here's just a very simple example that I replace any numbers with just, you know, check boxes within it. What you need to establish first as a team is a determination of what are the value areas that automation should address. Those are your criteria that you're going to keep, like critical path, legal compliance, data environmental setup, reuse. And then for every single net new feature that you're developing, you're making that determination of, does it meet this requirement that we have on here? Do we have to do this for legal reasons? Do we have to do this because it's complex data setup? And you assign a score to each net new feature that you're developing. This allows you to actually prioritize things on the backlog, just like any other piece of work that you're doing, and saying, hey, if it's above this certain level, we absolutely have to do this. It must be automated. If it's below a threshold that we set, then it's a nice to have. But at the very least, you're working from the highest priority listing down to the lowest from that point on, rather than automating a bunch of low-level surface sort of validations that are great that they show you got a lot of tests in terms of quantity, but don't really provide a lot of quality. So what do we do from a framework and tooling perspective? Because we have a lot of options out there, especially with a lot of organizations using robotic process automation, RPA, for testing, or using AI-based testing. So here's one simple example. The message here is you choose the right tool for the job, for your team. Not what you'd ideally like to have, but knowing what those constraints are. So this is a terribly written test in Gherkin format. What does it use? In this case, it would use something that's very popular, and the reason why I chose this is because just about everyone here should have heard of Selenium, which is the most popular open source web-based automation tool with Ruby and Cucumber. But if I'm working with a team that doesn't use Ruby, I don't necessarily need to use this as a testing language to add more complexity. And do I need to use the open source tool all the time versus a commercial tool? There are other ones that can do the same. So what you need to do is actually select the right tool for the job, as in bias for success by aligning the new tools that you're bringing in that match the existing tech stack of the tools you have for the team or the organization. But Selenium is a good choice here if you have to do web testing. Why? Well, it's been implemented in just about every single popular programming language under the sun. It handles all the browsers that you need. And you have a massive amount of public support for it. Some open source tools don't really have a lot of support, and if you actually submit a request, say something is wrong here, you know, if there's only one or two people actually working on it and supporting it, don't expect them to immediately drop what they're doing in their day job to help you out. So if you have to go open source, use something that is very popular in the industry, so you're more likely to get updates according to the changing marketplace. You're more likely to get responses when you do have issues, and you're very likely to encounter the same issues that other people are encountering, so you have solutions out there. Otherwise, you may need to go with commercial tooling to help support you. So I showed the example of sort of these functional tests for execution, but we work at multiple levels, and I'm not going to show you that testing pyramid. For, say, integration testing is a core component of any pipeline that you actually want to build. And I have a reference here of tools that go back some 20 years if we look at like fitness on there. So what we want to do with integration testing is just ensure that our components work. This is sort of the weakest link, determines how strong your ultimate pipeline is and set of applications are. If you expect to work across multiple teams, multiple systems, then the team that has the worst practices are often the team that's going to be the cause of most of your failures. So you need to have strong integration testing in place in part of your pipeline. A general rule of thumb to follow is every stage of my build pipeline should have some form of validation associated with that. Whether it's security scanning, accessibility scanning, linters, unit test, you can use code coverage on that, and that's what you'll actually go to. You can use code coverage checks for unit testing to make sure that if someone's submitting something new, even though we may be bad with unit tests before, we can ensure that any sort of net new merge request is going to add to our test coverage and improve. Every stage of our pipeline should have some form of validation, ideally an automated validation associated with it. And it doesn't need to be a full-on reject like a check coverage rule. Even GitHub, they use a sort of a deferred compliance rule, which is if they encounter an issue, if it's not an absolute build breaker, they will send off notifications via Slack to the team that actually committed that code saying you need to resolve this within 24 hours. If you don't resolve it within 24 hours, it gets reversed. So that's the approach that you should generally take is, yes, unit testing more important than integration, integration more important than functional, same as it's always been, but you need to introduce these checks that make it visible for everyone on the team. If you make it so that it's just one person responsible for it, as soon as that person leaves the team, you're gonna fall back to the prior state. So what are the most common challenges that you can encounter when looking through? Well, the name of the presentation is the automation Firehose, and that's generally it when I go into a new team and teach them how to use a tool. They get so excited and they want to use the tool everywhere, which means that they end up generating a bunch of crap. Because if your process and test are wrong and you apply the test to everything you want to do with that new tool, you're going to run into trouble. It's not about automating everything. It's about automating those candidate test cases that I showed you from that checklist and scorecard. Just because a scenario can be automated doesn't mean that it should. So use that risk-based approach to your automation. Additionally, data. So you have a test, it works great, executes in lower environment, you push up to the next level on your way to production, and it fails. It fails because the data that you reference isn't there. So you need to make sure for any work intake to your team that control over your environment and your data is essential, that it works across multiple environments. So that means test data generation and manipulation is an upfront concern. Every year, Capgemini/Sogeti release what's known as the World Quality Report, where they've taken a survey of hundreds of quality engineers across the world. The top 3 that generally switch around are related to, I don't have data to execute my tests. 2 is, my environment isn't set up for me to execute. And 3 is, I don't have enough time to do my job. So these are the 3 concerns that you need to address when you're actually going to approach any sort of automation challenge. The other common one that was referenced recently is those flickering tests or flaky tests. So these are tests that if you hold everything the same within your system and execute the same test multiple times, they will pass, fail, flickering on and off like a set of Christmas lights. These are bad tests for multiple reasons. One is you've lost insight into the current state of your application. 2, you've reduced confidence in your application. Because if you have a CI report that gets sent back to you where you have 50% of your tests fail and it's a different 50% every time, people are going to stop looking at that report that email, that dashboard won't mean anything, and they'll just discard it. So what you should do is take those flickering tests, address them as technical debt. And if for whatever reason you have flickering tests that cannot be resolved, remove them. Those should be manual tests that are required to validate and not automated tests. So the source of flickering tests could be something as simple as data and environment that I previously referenced. It could be the application flakiness itself, which is technical debt for the application. It could even be your own poor automated test code. It happens. We do make mistakes. But you need to address those flickering tests. The other common one that I've seen with a lot of teams are long tests. Tests that are 300 lines long, validate dozens of things. So what happens when you get a failure early on? For most automated test frameworks, you say, hey, I failed this, and you skip and go on to the next test. So not only do I have a failure that I have to investigate, but I've got dozens of other validations that I've just missed. I've got gaps in my test coverage now. So ideally, each test that you generate, regardless whether it's unit, integration, functional test, system integration test, et cetera, should validate one thing, no more, no less. And when you're writing tests, just like good development practices, you want to keep it simple, understandable for everyone. You want to make it atomic. So that way it's clear what failed, what is passing. Do you have consistent problems with, say, your email server? Or is there something larger that you have to address? The other is the common one that we face with development practices, which is you build on a shaky foundation. So you're trying to get through, finish up for the sprint, set the story card to done, get to the next release, and so you make sacrifices. You know, I'll get it done today, and I'll put a to-do on it, and you don't end up coming back to it. You just keep on adding in to those failures of process. And what ends up happening is you have an automation framework that is so weak that it collapses under its own weight eventually. And you throw it away and redo it. I've seen this happen with teams that don't want to adopt practices to maintain the sustainability of a framework, that after a couple of years, they go, we can't use this, or I don't know what this person did. And they end up throwing it away and restarting. So the same practices that you would expect for good development code, like using don't repeat yourself, keep it simple, stupid, with scheduled code reviews, code analysis tools, and refactoring sessions, are things that you should adopt for your automation as well. Again, treat your automation code with the same care that you would expect for your development code. The last one is very common, which is also lagging behind development. I will hear, often it will be from like product owners or scrum masters of, we finished the development work this sprint. Next sprint, we're gonna do a testing sprint. It's like, your work ain't done if you did the development without the testing. But that's the challenge, is you often have development bleed into where you need to actually do those validations. You only have a day or half a day left, and you gotta move forward. So what you actually need to do is have automation feasibility be incorporated into your definition of ready, and those completed scripts as part of your definition of done. You can adopt practices that say, hey, we either have deferred compliance or we are not going to go through because you have a code check coverage rule in, say, GitLab, GitHub, that are going to preclude you from actually merging this code unless you have validations in place. Ensure that before we ship out our work, that we've actually validated and followed the team standards. And it's easier to use those with preventive controls, detective controls that are automated than by individual heroics. So what are some things you can do to address these challenges? What are some quality standards to adhere to? Well, at this point in time, I've shown you a lot of different superheroes from the Marvel universe. This is my personal superhero, Martin Fowler. He says, I'm not a great programmer. I'm just a good programmer with great habits. So what are some things we can do with automation that will help us? Well, for one, is you have that same expectation for your test automation that you do for your development code. You adopt a common set of standards, whether it's, you say it has to be understandable by the team, the data has to be in place so we can execute across multiple environments, it's not duplicative of effort, and it's understandable by everyone in the entire team. You introduce these code standards and you make these code reviews standard as well. As in, you're not gonna have one person, a John or a Jill, responsible for automation, and they're the only person doing it on the team. It's every development team member is responsible for automation. Additionally, refactoring should be a total team activity. So refactoring cares about maintainability, extensibility of your code, and domain knowledge. And the ways you improve it is you look at ways to optimize for performance. We're stripping out outdated knowledge, removing duplicated code, and implementing non-orthogonal design. But this is different than you just sitting there deciding, hey, I'm going to refactor this code. I'm going to refactor this feature, reduce the number of lines of code. Instead, to make it sustainable, you need to make it a team activity. What I like to do is make it just simply a half hour every other week. Development team is present. One person is identified as that team leader. They're responsible for scheduling the meeting, for delegating the work, for selecting the focus area, and generating any sort of bug report for our own code. The automation guide can be either someone within the team who's an expert, or what I preferably like to do, to have people from outside the team who have expertise in the space come and sit in. Right? They're going to be there to be that technical oracle, to help the team overcome challenges, to track the session. Because if we're taking time away from the team, in this case a lot of team members for 30 minutes every other week, we want to show the value add. We want to show that as our application is aging, our quality is getting better. As we're adding to our application under test and test code, we are getting better. And the focus area itself for that session can vary each time you meet. It could be based upon a code metric report, feature items, a project release, something from your automated regression, or a CI report. So this way, you make it a total team activity where those senior members can work with the junior members and uplift them, where you're not just focused on your user story to get done for that sprint, but you get to see the bigger picture. And because you're all there together, it's a total team activity that it's community driven. We are all responsible. This is not my code, your code, it's the code, and we're gonna be judged on the quality of it. So in summary, what are some of the things that we learned today that are essential to effective test automation? Well, we should focus on that fastest, most robust tests. The UI and end-to-end tests are still valuable, but because they are more prone to flakiness, we need to focus on those things within our pipeline that could be more successful, those service level validations, those unit tests. We still have end-to-end, but those are more focused from the business perspective. We should build our automation based upon the probability of failure, the impact of business, and on complexity. We can't automate everything, so we automate the things that are going to be the most valuable. They're going to align with our business goals, and that's where we're actually going to get the time to do it. We're always going to be limited by the project budget, the schedules that we have to follow, the technical skill set. You can't work within a perfect circumstance, so don't get frustrated by it. Instead, understand the constraints of your system and optimize within that before worrying about how to optimize those other constraints that you have and increasing throughput. You have to show value before you can go back and actually get support to expand your program. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.